Hey guys, welcome back to another cult movie review. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the 1994 Gothic fantasy, The Crow. Now, this past week marked the 30th anniversary of the film's release in North America, so I thought what perfect time to sit down and review this 90s classic. Before we get into it, guys, of course, if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing. It goes a long way to help me build the channel. So, The Crow from 1994 was directed by Alex Proyas and starred the late Brandon Lee in the lead role. While the screenplay was written by David J. and John Shirley, the actual movie was based on the 1989 graphic novel by creator James O'Barr. Produced on a budget of $23 million, The Crow would go on to become a major hit with audiences and recoup over $90 million at the American box office. Since then, the film has spawned a series of Crow sequels, which sadly have failed to live up to the original. You know, I still vaguely remember my first introduction to The Crow back in the late 90s. I think I was about 9 years old at the time, and I just remember coming out of school and seeing my cousin and him showing me the VHS copy of the film. I distinctively remember the video cover art with Brandon Lee on the front with the Crow makeup. He was standing behind this fiery background with this sinister smirk on his face. It just was an awesome visual, and it immediately grabbed my attention. And, you know, after seeing that, I immediately wanted to go and watch the film, but being so young at the time, there was no way I was ever going to be allowed to. But fortunately, I did see the movie a few years later when I was about 13 or 14, and yeah, immediately fell in love with it. And thinking about it, it was probably for the best that I never saw the film as a kid, as there was a lot of aspects of the film that would have been lost on me. You know, by the time I actually got round to seeing the film, I was already a fan of bands like The Cure and Nine Inch Nails, both of whom contributed to the film's soundtrack. I also knew about the grunge and goth movements of the early 90s, so I was able to appreciate The Crow on a much deeper level as a teenager. Now, before we get into the review, I have to address the tragic passing of actor Brandon Lee. Brandon, the son of martial artist Bruce Lee, was accidentally shot while filming The Crow in 1993. Brandon was on set and he was struck in the chest and immediately rushed to hospital, where he later died. Being only 28 at the time, yeah, I mean, it's such a tragic loss, and the whole ordeal makes you think about the fragility of life. The actor had so much potential, and then it was all gone. A few days ago, I went back and read up on Brandon Lee's death, and there was one major detail I was completely unaware of. That detail was that Brandon Lee was accidentally shot by a co-star of his, Michael Massey. Massey was the one responsible for pulling the trigger that later killed Brandon Lee. And I must say, reading that, I was quite surprised, just because I was kind of like, how did I miss that detail after all these years? And so, yet another layer of tragedy, having Massey, a young actor at the time, caught up in this dire situation. Of course, it was an accident, but having that on your conscience would be hard for anyone. It's just good to know that Massey was able to put that behind him and continue working in the industry until his death in 2016. So anyways, let's get on with the review. The film started with this beautiful lingering shot of Detroit on a rainy October night. The police were responding to a brutal home invasion that had just taken place. We would later discover that the victims were musician Eric Draven and his fiancée Shelley Webster. Fast forward 1 year later, and the dead and buried Eric Draven would suddenly rise from his grave. Guided by a crow, Draven returned to his apartment, and through a series of flashbacks, we saw how the deadly incident unfolded. The whole sequence with the flashbacks was laid out really well, and it helped us, the audience, understand the severity of what had occurred just 1 year earlier. The remainder of the film saw Eric methodically take revenge on the thugs responsible for his murder. Now, there is a scene that I want to talk about where, towards the end of the film, we saw the Crow, Eric Draven, gatecrash a mob meeting. You had all the henchmen sitting across this long table with their guns loaded, ready to kill. And then Draven walks in so confidently as if he was the one in charge. The visual of Eric Draven sitting at the end of the table, legs crossed with a smile on his face, is just so good. You really got a sense that this Crow guy, Eric Draven, had zero fear, and it was just a matter of time before he got his hands on the ones responsible. You know, the scene itself would lead to an all-out gun battle, which was filmed very well. Lots of practical effects with bullets flying and blood splatter. And, you know, rewatching this scene again recently kind of made me realise just how much I miss this type of action. I find action sequences in today's cinema to be way too polished and choreographed. I mean, John Wick is great, don't get me wrong, but it lacks the rawness that this film had. Now, when it comes to Brandon Lee's performance, it was truly remarkable. You know, he practically owned the screen every time his character appeared. Lee's towering performance elevated the whole project, and it was absolutely Oscar worthy. I understand that the man died before the film came out, but a posthumous Oscar nomination would have been fitting. The character Eric Draven was this man physically scarred and emotionally damaged. This was all showcased perfectly through a range of emotions we saw the actor display on screen. You know, there's absolutely no denying that Brandon Lee fully immersed himself into this role, and his incarnation of the Crow really has transcended through multiple generations. And if you ask me, to this day, his portrayal as Eric Draven has yet to be topped by any other actor. Furthermore, the movie featured a solid cast of supporting actors, including Michael Wincott, John Polito, and David Patrick Kelly, all of whom actually I'd previously seen in old episodes of Miami Vice. Having such a strong cast really propelled the movie's overall quality. Let's talk about the film's soundtrack here for a moment. The album, which was released in March 1994, featured an array of bands including the Jesus and Mary Chain, Pantera, and The Cure. Like the movie, the soundtrack was also successful upon its release, reaching the #1 spot on the US Billboard chart. Now, I personally love all those bands, and having them include their music into the film really added to the film's overall Gothic tone and vibe. And their music just was the perfect fit for The Crow. Now, what I found interesting was that the filmmakers incorporated the heavy rock music into the actual story. And when I think about it, that makes perfect sense, because the Eric Draven character was a musician playing in a band before he was murdered. And so the heavy soundtrack that we heard kind of embodied Draven's personality in who he was before he was killed. I personally love Draven's journey from aspiring musician to vengeful assassin. In regards to the cinematography, Dariusz Wolski, the film's cinematographer, created some unforgettable imagery that does deserve high praise. I mean, the impressive camera work and set design really helped Wolski create his fully realised vision of Motor City Detroit. I mean, it was wet, it was grotty, it was grimy, and definitely a place you would not want to visit. You know, when people look back at The Crow, many aspects of the film are rightfully praised. People love the performances and they love the action, but in terms of the film's overall tone and vibe, I feel Wolski's work gets overlooked. The same way the cinematographer Anton Furst collaborated with Tim Burton on the 1989 Batman movie, bringing Gotham City to life, Wolski, combined with director Alex Proyas, proved to be the perfect combination in bringing the Crow adaptation to the big screen. Now, The Crow has not only become a cult classic, but it's inspired many and has had a lasting impact on pop culture ever since its release in 1994. And in terms of lasting impact, I had to take a moment to mention the professional wrestler Steve Borden. Now, Borden, aka Sting, was a huge attraction for wrestling fans in the late 90s. He was a hard-hitting wrestler that became World Heavyweight Champion multiple times in his career. Now, the reason I bring up Steve Borden, the wrestler, is because midway through his career, he adopted the Crow aesthetic with the long hair and face paint. In fact, the changes that Sting made to his appearance only heightened his popularity, and he's now regarded as a wrestling icon. Now, I remember watching Sting years ago on TV, and I had no idea at the time his look was heavily inspired by the Eric Draven character. It was only a few years later did I realise the connection between the two. So yeah, just one example of the lasting impact the Crow movie had on pop culture. It inspired so many and spawned a whole generation of fans. And so, dislikes for The Crow 1994. My main dislike for the movie would have to be the Sarah character, played by Rochelle Davis. The Sarah character acted as Eric's sidekick, helping him throughout the film. Now, before we get into it, I just want to say this is a small dislike of mine, and overall, I thoroughly enjoyed the movie. It's just, at times, I found the Sarah character to be quite annoying. Now, I don't want to be too critical because the actress was very young and fairly inexperienced at the time, but for me, I found her performance very dull and one-dimensional. Her acting at times felt forced and her line delivery was also poor. I don't know. I just would have preferred a more versatile actress in the role. Someone who may have had more of a screen presence. When I think of the Sarah character, the more I get Terminator 2 John Connor vibes. It just felt like one of those old school Hollywood tropes inserting a kid into a very adult story. Was it necessary? Not exactly, but if you are going to do it, I think you have to cast a quality actor. But hey, on a positive note, I will say that whenever Davis was on screen with Brandon Lee, she did well, and there seemed to be a genuine natural chemistry between the two actors. Another dislike I want to mention would be the lack of screen time for actor Tony Todd. Todd played the gangster Grange, one of the henchmen in the film. Now, I've been a huge fan of Tony Todd ever since I watched him in The Candyman all those years ago. You know, Todd is a very talented actor, but he's underutilized in The Crow. The actor is capable of so much more, yet he's wasted as a side character in the story. Now, as we know, Brandon Lee's death caused many changes to take place in post-production. certain scenes were removed and re-edited, and I don't know this for sure, but I gather Tony Todd fell victim to the changes. And I say that because it just doesn't make sense to me that the filmmakers would cast a high caliber actor like Tony Todd and then just waste his talents. It's not a huge deal, but seeing the film again and seeing Tony Todd, it just made me think of the missed opportunities. And so, ratings for The Crow 1994. I'm going to be rating this movie a solid 7.5 out of 10. The Crow is this haunting piece of cinema that really stands on its own merits. It's somewhat of a poetic film that incorporated several genres, including horror, action, and romance. The film's mood and atmosphere was well established, and all the action set pieces were executed perfectly. As mentioned, the soundtrack was strong and almost acted as its own character within the movie. Creator James O'Barr produced a story of anger, pain and love, while Alex Proyas turned his vision into this Gothic masterpiece. I've seen some people online criticize the movie and argue that Brandon Lee's death propelled the movie into achieving its cult status. As in, if Lee had never died on set, this movie would never have been taken seriously and would just be forgotten. I strongly disagree with that. Because, while there's no denying that the death certainly overshadowed the film, I truly believe the movie would have gained a cult status regardless of the on-set accident. Taking a step back and looking at the whole project, there was just too much good stuff going on here for it to be disregarded. So people have their opinions and they're entitled to them, but that's something that I don't agree with. Even though this was based on a comic book adaptation, it's safe to say that Eric Draven is no superhero. His story wasn't about setting a moral example to the people of Detroit. It's actually about a man being given a second chance to right the wrongs of those who took everything away from him. Many sequels have come and gone, but it's only this original movie that has stood the test of time. It's been 30 years since the movie was released, and it's still a poignant movie experience that reminds us all that life is fleeting, but love is forever. And that's all from me today, guys. Hope you've enjoyed this review of The Crow. I will be back next week with more movie reviews. If you haven't already, please do subscribe. And of course, take care. I'll see you all real soon. Bye-bye.